Good evening, and greetings in the name of Yahweh, who loves us as Father and Mother, and Jesus, who alone is our risen, resurrected, reigning, returning Redeemer, the Holy Spirit, who in our purpose, presence, and power preserves us perfectly. We are excited to be here again, the Radical Grace Church here in Grand Rapids. I'm your host, Pastor Adriel Seville Morgan, and this is our Wednesday evening, keeping it real, relevant, and raw as we deep dive into the Bible, our roadmap from earth to glory. And we have been dealing with Romans for the past several months. We're almost to the end. But Romans, as I've said many times, is not a book that you sprint through. It's a book that you take your time and wade through some sometimes uncomfortable waters. And so either way, we are grateful for you joining us here today in the sanctuary and also via Facebook on this beautiful, beautiful, beautiful day. Spring is next week. And we are grateful for a glimpse of the glory of what that will entail as we enjoyed this 70-degree day this afternoon. Also, before we get going, once again, thank Pastor Chris Meehan for stepping in on a very short notice on Sunday, and for all of you who were praying with and for me on Sunday. It's just a reminder that I'm not as young as I used to be, and that once in a while, I'm just not able to get up and do what I want to do and what I need to do. But I'm thankful that there's always a ram in the bush, that we had a great service, worship celebration on Sunday in my absence, because I don't believe that Radical Grace is me, and I'm not Radical Grace. And so it's important that we are able to move forward with either when I am not present. But I'm grateful to be present. I'm grateful that healing is taking place. I do not feel 100% yet, but I'm here. I'm up, moving around. I've been at work the past couple of days, and we're moving in the right direction. So we continue to pray for so I can get back to 100% and be where Yahweh wants me to be. And so, again, we are looking at Romans. We're now in the 12th chapter. And by way of that, a little bit of an introduction to give you a little context. The 12, 1 and 2 are often quoted. I think if there's a lot of folk, even if you're not in a Bible class, that would easily probably be able to quote Romans 12, 1 and 2. And I want to remind you of where we are in terms of our breakdown of the book of Romans, that we've come through the idea of examining sin. And really, when I say this, what I think I may have mentioned, if I didn't, I'm going to mention it now, that this idea of sin, this is mudslinging. When you really consider it, and you can see that when you look at the way that Paul words his words, chapters 1 through 3, that you get the sense of him quoting. You get the sense of him saying what he's been told about the other group. Remember that there's two factions here in the Roman church. There's the Roman Christians who are Jewish converts, and then there's the Roman Christians who are Gentile converts. And so you got your Jewish Christians who are mudslinging against the Gentile Christians, and then the Gentile Christians who are mudslinging against the Jewish Christians. And Paul brings them all together by the time we get done with chapter 3 and says, well, we're all in the same situation, quite frankly. We're all in the need of salvation. Salvation is presented to us exactly what that looks like, what Jesus did for us, from chapter 3, verse 21 through 5 and 11. And in that, we are seeing the explicit explanation of Yahweh's grace towards us, towards everybody. That we then move forward to sanctification. How are we kept by that grace? Well, his power sanctifies us through the Holy Spirit, and that was chapter 5, verse 12, through chapter 8, verse 39. We then we just kind of ended our trek through the very complex task of understanding sovereignty, election, things of that nature. and his sovereignty that he shows to both the Jewish and the Gentile Christians together. And that ended chapter 9, verse 1, all the way through chapter 11, verse 36. Which brings us, so all of this is the background, sets us up for being brought into the very last section of Romans, which now we look at service. So we went from sin to salvation, sanctification, sovereignty, to service. And it's Yahweh's glory as shown through service. So the main theme of chapter 12, and quite frankly the remainder of the book of Romans, you're going to notice, is this concept of living peaceably with one another. Living peaceably with one another. In fact, it literally says that in verse 16. Verse 16 of chapter 12. Live in harmony with one another. Literally. There it is, 18. If it is possible, as far as it depends on you, live at peace with everyone. So the end result, the end request that Paul has, and when we talk about service, when we talk about the glory of Yahweh, I believe it hangs on verse 16 and verse 18 right there. That if we are truly living at peace, if we're making the effort to live at peace with one another, to serve one another, and in turn serve him, that's how we're showing the glory. So, let's offer this prayer for understanding, and then we will get back into it. I'll open up with this prayer that is the end of chapter 11. Oh, the depth of the riches of the wisdom and knowledge of God. How unsearchable his judgments, and his paths beyond tracing out. Who has known the mind of the Lord, or who has been his counselor? Who has ever given to God that God should repay him? For from him and through him and to him are all things. To him be the glory forever. Amen. And so this is where we end up. The very first thing it says is therefore. And so that's important. Whenever you see a therefore, the last time we saw a therefore was it was in chapter 8. Another very famous verse. Therefore, there is now no condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus. It's important. You cannot understand the therefore until we look at what's before. So if you're joining us for the first time, I encourage you to go back to earlier, Keeping It Real, Relevant, and Raw, see what we've been talking about up to this point, so that you can follow along with what our therefore really is. The therefore is essentially going all the way back through all of this. But most recently, it's the idea that the main thing we come away with from chapter 9 through chapter 11 is Yahweh didn't abandon Israel. Yahweh didn't abandon the Gentiles. That we've all been called. We've all been called, or Paul uses the analogy of being grafted into a tree. That a tree grows its own branches, but Yahweh in his own way went to the lab and actually took a branch that was not originally a part of the tree, aka Gentiles, and put it onto the original tree. He did that through Jesus. And this is what we look at. I've mentioned this before, that when we pray to our Father who is in heaven, the statement who is in heaven is essentially us signing off on and agreeing with his mystery. It's agreeing with his sovereignty, his ability to do anything that he wants, when he wants, how he wants. And sometimes this is unpleasant, and sometimes this goes against what we want to believe and what we want to think. And the Bible has a word for that. When he does something outside of what we think and what we might want. Bible has a word for that. In fact, church has a word for that. We don't think of it this way, but essentially, when we see him acting in a way that's counter to what we think he ought to act, he's just being holy. He's just being holy. That's what holiness is. Holiness is acting completely otherly. And so I am grateful for his holiness, as Paul has said in chapter 11, because his holiness caused him to act against the norm of the time and against the nature and bring in this branch that otherwise would not be included because it wasn't a part of the covenant originally. So because of that, because of the justification and the salvation and the sanctification and having been chosen, because of that, we are called to present ourselves. And literally, he does use the word somata, bodies. Present our bodies as a living sacrifice. Now, we got to look at this in a couple of ways. First and foremost, understand that Rome is not known for its sacrifices. This is something that Babylonians would have understood. This is something that Akkadians would have understood. This is something that Jews understand, the word sacrifice. After all, we got all that literature in Leviticus that explains how to sacrifice, when to sacrifice. Sacrifice is a word that is kind of tugging on the strings of the Jewish Christians, but at the same time, it also tugs on the strings of the Gentile Christians because they both have an understanding of it. The Jews would see it, as I've already mentioned, according to what was going on in Leviticus. They see it as that sacrifice, what the prophet and the priest had to deal with. The Gentile Christians are going to see and read this idea of sacrifice in the eyes of idol worship. So at the end of the day, the Jews come away with it saying, this is how we worship Yahweh, through sacrifices. The Gentiles are going to look back and say, oh, so you mean what we do at the temple of Zeus, and what we do at the temple of Apollos, and what we do at the temple of so-and-so. And they're both seeing this as a form of worship. Now, there's a reason Paul is going to use this specific word, because it ties them in together. As I said, there's something from the background of both that we're both called to come and sacrifice. But we got to pay attention to one particular word. I did it wrong again. That word is living. Okay, come on now. Living. So we talk about thusion, sacrifice. Thosan. The word is translated as living. If we're not careful, we can make that stop at the fact that we're human beings. But if we deal with that word with a little bit more depth, we will see that a better translation of thosan, rather than alive or living, would be lively. It's defined as possessing characteristics of life and giving life, having potential to give life. You know the other time in the Bible where you see this word thosan? The book of John, chapter 4. If you knew who I was, then you would have been asking me to give you living water. Thosan. How is Jesus living water, the woman wonders. He uses a word not because he's there and he's alive. No. That doesn't do it. Because she's alive. What makes him different from her and what makes him different from us, not the fact that he's living and breathing, but the fact that he has the ability to bring life to people, to stir up life in someone. So I want you to think about that for a minute while we're talking about being a living sacrifice. stirring up life. How does my everyday living stir up someone to live? What do I do that encourages, inspires, and helps someone live? And the word sacrifice simply means that I do it not for my benefit, but despite myself, despite what it costs me. Buckle up. Here comes the question. What do I selflessly give up that will help someone else live? And before we start going into all of the things, because we could talk about, we got the rock next door, we give food. Well, yes, that's part of it, but let me just show you what Paul says. Because Paul seems to say that it's something even simpler than that. It's a good thing that we give food. It's a good thing. And we're not going to stop doing that. But for all of our creature comforts, there are some things that sometimes we in the church fail to do. And I don't just mean Radical Grace. I mean, I can go back to every church that I've ever been to, and there's always someone. Always someone. And it never fails. It's always someone who somehow seems to find themselves ushering or greeting at the door. Someone who permanently cannot smile. Someone who permanently just cannot say the words, hi, nice to see you, I'm glad you're here. These seem like trite things, but the fact of the matter is, I just want you to think. In our secular lives, you're going into the store or the restaurant. Because I've had it both ways. I've gone to a restaurant where I was immediately greeted with a smile and made to feel like I was welcome there, and they wanted my business. They got my business. And I've been to restaurants where I've gone and I've walked in, ain't nobody said nothing to me. They've walked by, they've seen me, they looked at me, they ain't said nothing to me, and I turned around and walked out. You didn't promote my liveliness to stay in this restaurant. How many times do we fail to promote the liveliness of following Jesus just by having a poor attitude? And this is how Paul goes and he says these things. I mean, there's a lot of stuff that he says, but he goes on to kind of to enumerate a lot of them, and he talks about in particular in 15, in verse 15, because I quote this a lot. I quote it from King Jimmy because that's how I learned it. Rejoice with those who rejoice, weep with those who weep. How does rejoicing inspire others to rejoice? We've talked about this before. Shouts are contagious. We've talked about weeping. Crying can be contagious. It can spur someone on to have a reaction and to remember themselves. This is why here at Radical Grace we encourage testimony. We encourage people to share their praise, their good news with one another, because I want to know what you're so excited about. Because I just might have happened. I know that Yahweh did something for me this past week, but I also might be a little bit on a struggle bus, and it might take to see you. It might take seeing you rejoicing and being happy to remind me, oh yeah, I can command my own joy. I can command the fact that I'm supposed to be rejoicing. All Paul is doing here is using very simple principles of dopamine sharing and understanding sociology and physiology to help us to see the importance of being zosan, living, lively sacrifices to one another. If for no other reason than because we've been called together to serve together. And let me say this, and this is something worth writing down as I got my little thing on here. It's going to be hard for me to turn it back around, but I'm going to remind you we're talking about service. It's showing Yahweh's glory through service. My claim is that smiling at one another and encouraging one another is very much a big part of service to one another. We don't think about that very often. Again, that can be trite. But it's a challenge for us. That when I come and I say on Sundays after the Lord's Supper, and some folk laugh at me, and some folk have to force it, but we really shouldn't have to force it because of his mercies, as it says in verse 12:1. Because of his mercy, the mercy that called us to be elected by him despite the sin on both sides. Because of the mercy that would cause him to send his only begotten son to die for us on our behalf, to pay the wages of the sin that is death. Because of that mercy, we ought to be able to encourage one another and rejoice with one another and weep with one another. Okay. So we're jumping all around 12. This is Radical Grace, and we do things in decency and order, so we're going to try to get back to what we're going over here. But I brought this up because, again, this is all one, and you can see that 12:1 in and of itself is just packed. We could spend a whole night talking about just verse 1. Therefore I urge you, brethren, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as lively sacrifices. Those lively sacrifices being holy. I just talked about holy. Holy doesn't mean that I'm floating. Holy doesn't mean that I'm wearing all white. Holy doesn't mean that every other word out of my mouth is bless you, my child. Holy simply means that I am not afraid to give myself up to be used by Yahweh in whatever way he sees fit. This is the Greek. Holy and pleasing to God. Pleasing. Iraeston. Iraeston. From eu and apestos. Or arestos, I'm sorry. Eu meaning well. It's an adverb that means well. And arestos meaning fit. So again, collectively, all 12:1 says is I present myself to be used however way it needs to be so that I can actively promote someone's life and help someone live better in a way that how you don't know how, I'm open to how whatever that looks like. So I'm not going to, what this means is, this is very clear, the idea of holy means that I don't put limits on what I'm going to do and what I'm not going to do. That, yes, there are certain skills that I have, and there are certain skills that I don't have. But being holy and being a sacrifice means that I'm not going to say no. I'm going to say I'm going to try, and we'll see if it works. Because if it doesn't, there's another ram in the bush. But a lack of holiness says that's not what I do. A lack of holiness puts up a wall and says, I refuse to allow myself to be presented this way. That's just what it says. So this is your spiritual act of worship. Again, bringing it back to both parties. This is what worship looks like. And what's interesting about this is, for the Jews, the sacrifice is dead when it's presented to Yahweh. Leviticus never talks about offering a living sacrifice. It always talks about a dead sacrifice or a grain sacrifice, something that's not breathing. Now it's alive. How does that matter? I say it this way. Because whenever someone is in awe, maybe a little jazzy, maybe a little petty of me, but I'll admit I do this. Whenever some athletes, let me just say it right, ball players try to compare themselves to athletes. Because a ball player, you manipulate a ball. And let's be clear, pitching is difficult. Batting is difficult. Dribbling is difficult, because I can't dribble. Throwing a perfect spiral with a football is difficult. Kicking a soccer ball is difficult. I admit that. I'm not saying it's not. But I'm going to say this. I believe that it's easier to manipulate a football, a soccer ball, a baseball, a volleyball, than it is for me to jump 25 feet. Why do I say that? Because my brain has already told my body what positions my body's supposed to be in. My brain has already told my body I don't belong in the air. So the entire time that I'm in the air while I'm long jumping, my brain is trying to get my body to come back down to the ground where it's comfortable. The fact that it's alive presents a problem, because something that's alive can fight back. For all of you that are not vegetarians in the house, I want you to imagine trying to cook, and the thing that you're trying to cook is alive. I want you to imagine that roast mooing at you, refusing to get into the oven. I want you to imagine that bacon oinking at you, refusing to get into the pan. When it's alive, it can fight back. It has a mind. It has a mind. This is something that we want to make sure that we point out, because some people will try to say that there's no thinking involved with Christianity. And I've been to churches. I have been to churches where their favorite thing to say is, we need to stop being here and be here. That couldn't be more incorrect. There's clearly an appeal right here. The fact that we're bringing up being alive, and also when you're using the word urge and beseech, seems to say that this is something that we have the ability and the responsibility to think about. Not to feel absent-mindedly and without any kind of education, but we're supposed to think about this and process it. And if that weren't enough, he keeps on going. And he says, he uses the word that's translated as reasonable. Reasonable act. It's translated as spiritual act here. That the word translated as spiritual act here is referring to something that is reasonable. And essentially, if you want the whole drawn out thing, what Paul is basically saying is, I need you to reconsider. I need you to replay in your mind and rethink about chapters 1 through 11. Which again, if I could spin this thing around a little bit easier, I would show them to you. I need you to think about chapters 1 through 11. That because of all of that, how could you possibly think through 1 through 11 and still arrive at, nah, I'm good? How could you possibly think about justification through Jesus when we couldn't do it ourselves in our own weakness, that we were given a way to get back to him and say, I don't do that. I don't even want to try that. How could we possibly think about and read chapters 1 through 11 and see that he's called all men unto him, and then when it comes time to think about accepting all men in his church, have the audacity to sit back and say, no, we don't want to do that? That's a problem. That's not your spiritual act of worship, Paul says. That's not it. That if you've truly considered and truly read through 1 through 11, you'd be doing this better. This is the decision that you're going to make. And I need to be clear when I say that. This is the decision you are going to make. This is a thinking proposition. This is the thought that you are going to come to. And it's that thought that lines up with the will of God. When we think will of God, oftentimes, and there'll be a whole nother study about this a little bit later, because my mentor, Dr. Gary Meters, Professor Emeritus of New Testament at Grand Rapids Theological Seminary, one of my favorite profs when I was in seminary, wrote a book called Decision Making in God's Way, and we're gonna get that book, and we're going to go through a book study here at Radical Grace, because it's a powerful book, and it helps us to see the different ways that we can line up with the will of God. Because I feel like, and you'll see, just like I did when I read the book, we've been getting that wrong. Once again, because we've been making it way too holy. We've been making holy be unattainable. We've been making holy be in the clouds. We've been making holy be something that is so different, can't apply to us. And that can't be the case. If that were the case, he wouldn't say, be holy like I am holy. All that means, I'm telling you right now, all that means is be willing to do what nobody expects you to do. Be willing to go against the grain. Be willing to go outside of your comfort zone. That's all that means. And so when we look at this concept of being in line with the perfect will, I will claim to you in that same way, because we're all about, right now anyway, looking at words, that when we start talking about his perfect will, we are, in fact, talking about his thoughts. His thoughts. So, in other words, I need my thoughts to line up with his thoughts. And I don't want you to miss this. Paul seems to say that your thoughts will line up perfectly with his thoughts when you do what? Go back and read and study and think it over. Seems to be that when I am thoroughly involved in understanding the word of Yahweh God, that I can see what he's thinking, not the words on the paper, but I can get in an understanding of what he's thinking. And that helps me develop my thinking in a way that lines up with his thinking. And if my thinking lines up with his thinking, then very naturally my actions line up with what his actions would have been had he had a body, but he's not, he's a spirit, right? So this is why it's fitting to him when we do these things, because this is his body. The church is his body, and I operate on his behalf by giving myself to do things that I normally would not do that are going to help someone feel more alive. All right. So this is Romans 12. This is Romans 12. For by grace given me, I say to every one of you, do not think of yourself more highly than you ought, but rather think of yourself with sober judgment in accordance with the measure of faith God has given you. I'm going to pause right there because it's dangerous to read things out of context. Remember what we're dealing with here. Paul does not just come out and just start telling folks, don't be conceited. Don't be conceited as it pertains to your standing in the kingdom. That is in particular. Remember, this is a calling of unity. This is a call to come together and work and serve in unity. And the worst thing that can happen when there's a call to come and serve in unity is, I'm not doing that because that's beneath my station. Or I'm not doing that because that's not how it goes in my tradition. Remember, you got your covenant Jews, you got your outsider Gentiles. Both are coming with some kind of baggage, some kind of customs, some kind of traditions. And you've got a little bit on both sides of this ain't nobody right but us. Paul's already dealt with that. Chapters 9 through 12 and also 1 through 3. And so he reminds them again, don't come with that. Don't come in here. Don't come into the house and into the kingdom of Yahweh thinking your way or the highway. You haven't made any sacrifices for anyone. You have not done something that has justified everybody. This whole thing, you're only where you are by his radical grace. And I'm so thankful he uses that word. For by the grace given me. Do not think more highly than you ought, but rather think of yourself with sober judgment, accordance with the measure of faith that God has given you. That you only think, you only have faith because it's been given to you. You didn't arrive there by yourself. You didn't wake up born that way. Regardless of what family you grew up in, Yahweh has seen fit to put some people and some situations in your life that would help you to process in your mind and arrive at this place of faith. So just as each of us has one body with many members, and these members do not all have the same function, so in Christ, we who are many form one body, and each member belongs to all the others. We have different gifts according to the grace, there's that word again, given us. If a man's gift is prophesying, then let him use it in proportion to his faith. If it is serving, the Greek word diakonos, where we get our word deacon. And I need to point out that that word diakonos, because this is something, especially today in the church, and let me be careful how I say this. Because yes, the labor is worth their hire. But one thing that we've got to be really careful about is always insisting on being paid to do something. That's not thusion. Now, there are certainly staff positions in the church, and they need to be, because, secretarial work, administrative work is difficult. It's a lot. It's a full-time job. Minister of music is difficult. It's a lot. It's a full-time job. And those are things that we should value and pay. But not everything in the church ought to require a paycheck. Some things ought to be a thusion. Just because it's the gift that you've been given by the grace, the radical grace of Yahweh God. It is a gift to be able to serve. It is a gift to be able to preach. It is a gift to be able to teach. It is a gift to be one who is capable of encouraging. Some folk just can't do it as well as others. It's a gift. And if I've been given that gift, the radical grace of me holding on to that gift says that I should not frustrate that radical grace, but rather I should be willing to use it and to present myself able to be used for the benefit of the kingdom. Contributing to the needs of others. Let them give generously. Some folk are in a better position to give than others. And if that's where you are, that's your gift. And you better believe that you're in that better position to give than others because of his radical grace. But for the radical grace of Yahweh God, you would be the borrower and not the lender. And so we certainly take a look at this and we say all of these parts together still make up one body and still make up one church. And let it be clear that if we again look at the historicity of Rome, what you're dealing with here, let me say that Rome is very knowledge bent. One of the things that the Greeks become very famous for is being all about head knowledge. Much like certain denominations. So they then, because they're so knowledgeable, are more inclined to teaching. Paul does, in fact, he's not bifurcating them in terms of Jews and Gentiles, and some Jews teach and some Gentiles teach. What he's actually doing, if you really look at it, when he starts delineating, there's some by their tradition are better equipped to teach. Some by their tradition are better equipped to preach. Some by their tradition are better equipped to encourage. Some by their tradition are better equipped to give. He's splitting them up according to the traditions that they've come with. He's addressing the division by making them understand that these divisions are better if celebrated and promoted, and when they come together, we're actually one pretty powerful church. All of our traditions together. And so he closes all that out. Well, closes all of that out, but he keeps on moving and pretty much gets ready to end chapter 12 by saying love must be sincere. And it comes out of nowhere, it seems, because at no point has he mentioned the word love up until now. So that's what would lead us to believe that this is a whole nother section. A whole nother section. And love is agape in this case. I know you've probably heard that word before. And agape is in particular a type of love, not brotherly love necessarily, and it's not eros, that's erotic love, but agape is the type of love that is sacrificial. So he pulls back towards thusion once again. Agape, or sacrificial love, must be sincere, without dissimulation, the King James says. Anuk akritos. Anuk akritos is the Greek word, and what it means is, well, let me write that down for you, because some of you are taking notes here. Anu, I'm sorry, not anupakritos. What did I do with my anupakritos? Anupakritos. Anupakritos. What you see there is a combination of the first part, which is alpha, and alpha has the Hebrew origin of meaning first. Let me say alpha and omega, the beginning. However, it can also be used, you know, when we do a something. A can come as a prefix to undo what comes after it. So we're going to look at the last part there, Anupakritos, which might sound familiar because it shares a similar stem with hypocrisy, hypokritos. And hypokritos, so it says without hypocrisy. Literally, without hypocrisy, without underwriting, without backbiting, without fakeness. Let this sacrifice be done truly as sacrifice, truly without trying to get something because you're doing it. And do stuff legitimately. And illegitimately would be to hate what is evil, cling to what is good, be devoted to one another. Here's Philadelphia, in brotherly love. Honor one another above yourselves. Never be lacking, watch this, in zeal, a Greek word that literally refers to burning up. A Greek word that literally refers to burning up. Never be lacking in burning up. What do we mean by that? Well, go back to liveliness. That service, from the Greek word theo, which means to boil with heat. Theo means to boil with heat. So, never be lacking in the boiling. Never be lacking in boiling. What does that look like? Again, I have to ask the question. And it makes me wonder. Because if I am trying to, it's an interesting line that we need to be aware of. And I think it boils down to mindset. This is why I said for us to do some thinking and some processing. If we go through the process, if we remember Romans 1 through 11, then I don't think that we would arrive at the idea of energy and volume being something that is show-offy and something that we ought not aspire to. I don't think we can come to that. I do think if I start off here without looking at the context, and I believe that there's some churches that have done this, that have just said, out of context, it says, we ain't be boiling. We ain't loud for no reason, and not understand what the loudness is. Understand that the loudness comes from the radical grace. The radical grace is what stirs up the boiling pot. The radical grace is what makes us feel lively and want to help others feel alive. And so when we look at that, when we look at it that way, there's got to be fervor in serving Yahweh. It's impossible for me. I don't serve a dead God. I can't be dead in my service. I'm not trying to, And see, I think this is where the thing comes in, because you got some other religions, some other traditions that trying to draw folks to Buddha, trying to draw folks to Confucius, trying to draw folks to Muhammad, who are clearly dead. They have tombs. These folk are dead. How do you attract someone to serve a dead God? Somehow they get it done, but I claim that it's a lot easier to promote a God that keeps me alive and livens me and makes me want to shout his glory and declare his wonders to everyone that I meet and quicken them and help them live better. Because we serve a living God. Do we not serve a living God? If we serve a living God, then we are stirred up to be alive by the radical grace of our living God. So, this is where we end up with my last 8 minutes. Everything we see in chapter 12 has a combination of a couple of things. I'm going to tie it up with a nice pretty with a bow, and then we can get out of here and go enjoy the rest of the sunshine. Jesus said that all the commandments hang on two. Love Yahweh God. Love your neighbor as yourself. Read chapter 12 again. See if chapter 12 does not hinge on love Yahweh your God. Love your neighbor as yourself. See if chapter 12 does not present the church as a whole and locally with a great mission to make as its priority, as our priority, to make our worship and our hospitality. Those two things in particular. I believe chapter 12 calls us by the radical grace of Yahweh God to be more hospitable and to be better worshipers in such a way that it livens people. And that we are made to liven each other when we're in service together and when we're out in public, that my worship is not confined to the sanctuary, but my worship livens people. And on top of that, it's not A, not B, it's A and B, my service to others on top of that also livens them. I've said before, we have no idea what it would accomplish sometimes to just stand at the door and smile. There is somebody who's going to walk through that door who, more than an understanding of theology, more than an understanding of prevenient grace, more than an understanding of limited atonement, needs to be smiled at genuinely, without hypocrisy. Needs to be told genuinely and without hypocrisy that I'm glad to see you here, that I am so glad that you made it through the week and that you showed up on our doorstep, and we can't wait to help you feel more alive. And if that is not, that, I would say that needs to be the personal mission statement of everyone in the church. And then collectively, I would challenge Radical Grace for sure, that it become our church mission statement. Hospitality and worship that livens all who come in contact with us. That's chapter 12 in a nutshell. You'll hear more about chapter 12 if you join us Sunday morning 10 o'clock for our worship celebration. Before that, we do have our foundations and spiritual transformation, 9 a.m. in the basement with our elders. If you show up, you will know up and you will grow up. And that'll make you feel alive. So we look forward to seeing you Sunday morning as you join us for our worship celebration. And until then, you lift each other in prayer and lift Yahweh in praise.